everyone has a general idea about what disco is in their own minds. Mm-hmm. So what is your definition of disco?
It's just all part of the vibe.
Disco's a vibe.
I can't define. I don't know the music necessarily. I don't know the defining characteristics of the music, but it's what's playing when you have an afro and you're wearing daisies and you're roller skating.
Disco is, at its most basic, a genre of dance music, but it's also its own subculture. It's a vibe.
Its own vibe.
Yeah. It is commonly seen as a fad, which it kind of was, and is one of the most short-lived musical phenomena in history. But its impact was massive. Disco was a prominent form of dance music in the 70s. It got its name from the clubs that first started playing it, that were called discotheques. The music was beat-driven and repetitive, making it very easy to dance to. A lot of the top artists of the 70s played disco music, including ABBA, the Bee Gees, Earth, Wind & Fire, KC and the Sunshine Band, and the Village People. Although the artists get a lot of credit for disco, the producers working behind the scenes played a large part in developing the traditional musical styles of disco. The music was very layered, with soaring vocals, horns, a chicken scratch rhythm guitar, electric pianos and synthesizers, and repetitive beats.
I'm on board.
The rhythm is generally a syncopated bass line.
I'm on board.
Artists would use a wide variety of orchestral instruments to create a melody line, and most disco songs have a 4/4 beat.
I think I like disco.
A lot of musical styles use similar elements to disco, but what differentiates disco from something like rock music
is the vibe,
which also traditionally uses syncopated rhythms in a 4/4 beat, is the 4 on the floor of the bass drum. It means that the bass drum hits every beat. Disco can be seen as a reaction against the counterculture of the 60s and the mocking of dance music that typically happened within that culture. But disco also came about basically in tandem with the psychedelic rock culture. During the 60s, the younger generation had a lot of stuff to be worried about. Racism, homophobia, war, soaring crime rates, unemployment, etc., etc.
It's really like not a lot changed, actually.
It's like it changed and then went right back to bad.
It's
just cyclical. Especially if you were a member of the marginalized class, like the LGBTQ community or a person of color, it could be hard to find safe places back then.
Whoa.
So dance clubs, especially in New York City, became those safe places. They became places for people to get their mind off of things, to just escape for a bit and have some fun for the night. During the 1960s, a European style of dance club started to get popular. It was called discotheque dancing, and clubs popped up in major U.S. cities, most notably New York, but also Miami and L.A. At the time, these clubs weren't playing what we would now call disco. They were playing R&B, soul, funk, and other primarily African-American genres. Also in the 60s, these types of clubs started to adopt elements of psychedelic subculture. They started to use overpowering sound systems, free-form dancing, drugs, and light shows to enhance the experience. The origin of discotheque clubs is actually kind of interesting. During World War II, cities in France frequently had nightclubs that would feature jazz bands. When the Nazis took over, they instituted a ban on live music.
Why? Literally?
Just no fun.
Like... You know that everything is awful and horrible. And then it's just like, why did oh my goodness. Like, how do you have the mental capacity to be like the most racist ever and be like, oh, so no music? Like,
dancing leads to rebellion.
Can't have that. Oh my goodness gracious.
In Paris, though, they decided to keep the clubs going and they used records instead of live bands. The word discotheque means, quote, library of phonograph records in French. Different dance clubs in New York started to use the Parisian model. One club, called Arthur, featured a DJ who was the first person to play 2 records at the same time, creating a mix.
Get it, Arthur.
But the disco culture really came from the underground gay clubs in New York City, like The Loft, 10th Floor, Flamingo, 12 West, and others. These were the places in the early 70s that brought in open drug use and non-stop all-night dancing. The non-partnered dance style allowed people of all genders, races, and sexualities to escape for a while and do whatever they wanted.
I love it. I love it.
Most people put the start of disco at private dance parties hosted in DJ David Mancuso's house. On Valentine's Day of 1970, he needed money to pay the rent on his downtown loft. So he threw a party where people were encouraged to donate to the host.
That's so fun.
These things happened quite often, and they were often called rent parties.
Oh my God.
About 100 people showed up to that first party.
Holy cow, to one loft?
In his little loft, yeah. The parties were invite-only and non-commercial, which meant they were safe for the gay community. Eventually, these parties became more and more popular, and he started calling his house the Loft. It was an unofficial but legal underground nightclub.
I love it.
That business model inspired many other similar clubs. Mancuso had an insane sound system that was considered to be one of the best in New York, if not the world. Because even like before he started doing these parties, he was a big audiophile, so he just had like incredible speakers for just random reasons. Instead of using a popular technique known as beat matching to switch songs, he preferred to let songs play in their entirety. One of the attendees of these parties said, quote, "It was probably about 60% black and 70% gay. There was a mix of sexual orientation, there was a mix of races, mix of economic groups, a real mix where the common denominator was music," end quote. Mancuso operated the Loft under the idea that music could be more than just background noise at a party. He preferred songs with a more driving rhythm, but his one requirement was that the words had to impart a sense of hope, pride, or redemption.
Oh.
The very first party he hosted was called, quote, "Love Saves the Day," since it was on Valentine's Day, and it was to save his rent for his loft.
Gosh.
Mancuso continued to host parties at the Loft for 30 years. It switched locations. It wasn't always at that same downtown place.
Yeah, he probably needed a little bit more space.
But he unfortunately passed away in 2016.
I just walked in to find you here with that sad look upon your face. I should have
Gloria Gaynor, who was one of the first disco stars, said, quote, "I was out in the clubs in New York City in 1971, 72, feeling the pulse, knowing what was going on," end quote. In 1974, she released one of the first disco hits called Never Can Say Goodbye. It was one of the first records mixed exclusively for club play. It was around this time that disco started to move out of the clubs and into the national spotlight. Other disco artists started to score hits like Rock the Boat from the Hughes Corporation in 1974 and Everybody Was Kung Fu Fighting, which is one of the best-selling songs of all time.
I do not think of it as disco, but I see it now.
Yeah, it is. George McRae had a disco song in the UK that hit number one called Rock Your Baby. Well, in 1978, Gloria Gaynor would release probably her biggest hit called I Will Survive. It became a symbol for the feminist and the gay rights movements. The disco culture also created dances that songs helped to name. In 1975, Van McCoy released a song called The Hustle. And in 1977, Joe Tex released Ain't Gonna Bump No More, which introduced the wider public to the popular dance moves known as the hustle and the bump. The hustle was kind of more of a catch-all term used for a lot of different dances. Van McCoy sent his partner to a popular discotheque in New York City and ended up producing a ton of disco hits after that trip. His song, The Hustle, created basically a disco line dance and kind of solidified what the hustle was.
So fun.
The 1977 movie Saturday Night Fever showed two different versions of the dance, the line dance version and also the one that's like a partner dance.
Mm-hmm.
1975 also saw the rise of one of the most popular and influential disco bands, KC and the Sunshine Band. In 1973, Harry Wayne Casey worked at a record store and worked part-time as an assistant at TK Records near Miami. He met Richard Finch, who was engineering records for TK. The two decided to start a band and created a musical partnership that would be super influential. They wrote songs for other musicians before eventually forming KC and the Sunshine Band. They were soon joined by two TK studio musicians. The band was originally heavily inspired by something called a Junkanoo parade. And I am very sorry if I mispronounced that because it's a very important thing. But still,
What is it?
It's a parade that happens every year on Boxing Day in the Bahamas and in cities across the U.S. It's just like a celebration of something. I'm not really sure what, but it's very like Caribbean. The influence helped set them apart from other disco bands because they were getting more of that Latin flair that kind of like the New York ones didn't have. In late 1973 and early 1974, they released two singles that did well enough for their label that TK Records wanted a follow-up single and an album. So while Casey and the Sunshine Band were in the process of recording the album that the label wanted, the song Rock Your Baby which they wrote but was recorded by George McCrae, became a #1 hit in several different countries. They released their debut album in 1975, which started a chain of successful songs. 2 different singles from that album hit #1, and they were nominated for 4 Grammys and won one of them.
Nice.
The band's success lasted until their 5th album in 1979. Their last #1 was appropriately titled Please Don't Go. With disco heavily on the decline by this point, they just couldn't survive. In 1980, TK Records went bankrupt and Casey and the Sunshine Band joined Epic Records. Casey had a hit with more soft rock style duet in the early 80s, but it was far different than his disco hits. In 1985, after a couple of failed albums and songs, the band disbanded as Casey, quote, retired. But a 90s revival in disco brought him out of retirement in 1991, and he reformed the band with mostly new members. His partnership with Richard Finch was still done, though. They've since released a few different compilation albums as well as some new material. Casey also appeared on an episode of Diners, Drive-Ins, and Dives.
What?
I
That
think
is
he
so
owns
random.
restaurants in Florida, maybe.
What?
In 1977, the film Saturday Night Fever was released and was a huge success with one of the highest-selling soundtracks of all time. It was inspired by an article in New York Magazine that supposedly told the story of disco culture in the early to mid-70s, but it turns out the writer just kind of made it all up.
What? Writers don't do that.
Some people thought the movie was a watered-down version of disco, making it relatable for heterosexual white people.
I'm sure it was.
So despite people thinking that it was a watered-down version of disco, because of the string of hits that the Saturday Night Fever soundtrack created, disco had officially gone mainstream. The Bee Gees became the kings of disco with several major hits. Donna Summer started to write and record disco songs. The band Chic formed and incorporated more elements of psychedelic rock into disco. Their song La Freak is seen as an iconic song of the genre. Thanks to several independent labels like TK in Miami and Casablanca in Los Angeles, disco music dominated the airwaves. Established artists like Rod Stewart and the Rolling Stones released songs that were at least heavily inspired by disco. But by the early 80s, disco music started to decline. It was heavily criticized by primarily rock fans who saw it as overproduced and commercial.
I have to say, I'm done with rock fans now. I'm done.
Okay.
Rock started out as like a social movement and like a way to express things. And then they're just like, now it's just snobbery.
Yeah.
You don't get to snobberize rock. You don't. Like, that's not the, like, stop it. Stop it.
Sure. But at this time, even a lot of the disco pioneers started to think that the commercialization of the music started to overpower its roots.
I'm sure it did.
It was no longer about love and freedom from persecution. It was just kind of cheap, easy music. Even Motown started to make disco with their trademark music creation formula that took a lot of the explosiveness out of music.
That's pretty rough.
It was around this time that punk really started to gain traction, and punk artists/fans could often be very hostile to the disco culture.
That tracks.
Though some of them, like the Sex Pistols in the UK, really enjoyed disco music, others, like the Dead Kennedys, hated it. In their song Saturday Night Holocaust, the Dead Kennedys compared disco to Germany in the time right before the Nazis took over.
This is so interesting.
Knowing where it came from.
Where it came from. It's like how pretentious and then like set out from, I mean, I don't know anything about the Dead Kennedys, but like.
Just California punk band in the early 80s. I mean, they were a good punk band, but I don't trust them to really know anything about what's going on with disco music.
Goodness.
The Dead Kennedys criticized disco for being escapist and ignoring important things like political policy and social commentary, which it did, but that was by design.
That's the point.
To get people away from that.
Yes, literally, it's like, I'm going to pretend that I am oppressed and be mad about the government. Where like on the other side, you have actual like oppressed people being like, I need to have some sort of fun and release and like hope and like, it's just,
I also think it's fair to say that people like the Dead Kennedys probably had no idea where this music came from. They didn't know the roots and the history behind it. They just saw it as like frill and cheap, like
because they're getting the bubblegum pop,
they're
like
getting
top
the Bee Gees
Billboard.
version
Yeah.
of disco. The Bee Gees were never oppressed. They are not marginalized people. So they're getting that version of it and not the like 1974 New York club scene version of it.
Yeah.
So that's probably what they were pushing back against, was that more so than the like actual roots of it.
This
But
is a
I don't know,
reminder to
so.
me to not talk shit about stuff that I don't know about.
That's fair, yeah. But also, I think a lot of people don't know that history of disco. Like, I didn't really know it before doing this.
Yeah.
So, like, I probably would have also said, oh, it's just, like, silly, easy dance music. Like, it doesn't
Sure.
have a deeper meaning. So,
Sure.
like, I feel like unless you look into it, you're not going to know. And then you can very easily just discount it. July 12th, 1979 became known as the day that disco died. 2 rock station DJs used a baseball doubleheader as a protest against disco music. As you do.
I don't understand that sentence. Should I understand that sentence?
But they called it Disco Demolition Night.
Oh my God. That sounds like such a party if like the disco people actually got a hold of
Yeah.
it. Can you imagine the theme? Like that sounds awesome.
They-
They'd invent a new dance and everything.
They staged it as a promotional gambit for rock fans. They exploded disco records in between the 2 games.
I don't think that they would let us do that at our like
I don't think
baseball
so either.
stadiums.
But the crowd, stirred into a frenzy, ended up starting a riot.
What? Why? I couldn't imagine that happening.
They stormed the field, started fires, and generally destroyed whatever part of the stadium that they could.
I think that's why they don't let you blow things up.
After that night, the decline in disco popularity was super rapid. By September, so 2 months later, there were no disco songs in the top 10, and there were 6 of them in the top 10 in July.
That's actually like pretty sad because
Yeah,
it's just that the mainstream got a hold of it
and just
and
yeah,
commercialized it and ran it to the ground. And then we all have just kind of like a joke about disco in our heads about like, oh yeah, like
Yeah,
it's so cool. Like that's sad.
yeah. By the early 80s, disco was kind of seen as a joke. Radio DJs would make fun of it. It would be the punchline of some comedies, like a joke in the movie Airplane. It was no longer a hip thing. It was basically dead. With disco dying, several record companies were forced to fold or sell. Many of the super successful disco artists struggled to adapt. Even the Bee Gees, who were arguably the most popular disco act of all time, only managed to get one other song in the top 10 in 1989 for like the rest of their career. However, some artists managed to transition and stay successful. People like the Jackson 5, Donna Summer, and Kool and the Gang. Despite being an ultimately short-lived phenomenon in music history, disco impacted dance music culture forever. It started DJ culture. It inspired a lot of early
That's
hip-hop
so
and house
cool.
music. Basically, any dance-forward music after disco owes a massive debt of gratitude to disco. Anyway, that was disco. I think it was fun.
I
enjoyed
love
it.
disco.